Professor Nina Sunde is a police superintendent with a PhD in criminology and works as a researcher and lecturer at the Norwegian Police University College. She co-leads the Police and Technology Research Group and is actively involved in research projects, including the EU Horizon-funded Clarus project and EB crime. Her research primarily focuses on investigation practices related to digital evidence and cybercrime, with an emphasis on quality assurance and error mitigation in digital forensic investigations. With 25 years of experience in the Norwegian police, where she specialized in cybercrime investigations, Sunde brings extensive practical expertise to her academic work. I have had the pleasure to listen to her presenting on her PhD a couple of years back, and I know that we have a very interesting session ahead of us. So please settle in for the keynote presentation called Unpacking the Human Factor, Navigating Individual, Socio-Technical and Systemic Challenges in Incident Investigations. Welcome on stage, Nina Sunde.
Tusen tack. Thank you for the introduction, Mona. I'm honored to be invited here and grateful for the opportunity to give this opening keynote. So I work at the Norwegian Police University College. I have police background, as Mona said, and have gradually transitioned into an academic career. I have currently a professor competency in police science with specialization in digital policing. However, I still have my badge and position as a police superintendent, and I have several years of cybercrime investigation experience. And while I was doing that, I also attended my first conference, the first conference in Sevilla several years ago. So I look very much forward to this conference as well. So the topic of today's presentation is human factors, and we will look into individual, social, and systemic challenges in incident investigations. I will draw on both research and my experience from investigative and digital forensic work, and try to bring some perspectives into how we tackle errors and flaws and mistakes caused by bias. So when errors happen, there's often an intense search for the root cause. Was it a human? Was it a so-called bad apple? Was it poor technology? Was it outdated methodology? Or was it even nature itself causing the bias or causing the error? So what I will explore today is it even meaningful to search for a single root cause for bias and error? To examine these questions, we will explore 4 different perspectives. Cognitive bias, focusing on individuals. Bias in a social and collaborative setting, focusing on groups. Bias in a social-technical environment, bringing the non-human actors into our attention, such as systems, machines, and software. And lastly, bias from a systemic or organizational perspective. So first, we will start with cognitive bias. To clarify the concept, cognitive bias is a systemic deviance from what logically would be considered a rational decision or true outcome. And cognitive bias has been explored through research experiments since the 60s, through pioneers such as Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, Herbert Simon, Leon Festinger, Henry Teufel, and so on. And this research has been applied to domains such as criminal investigation, incident handling, and forensic science in the last at least 2 decades, I would say. And here we have gained knowledge about various biases and how they distort judgments and decision-making. And to zoom in on the mechanisms involved to create bias or to detect bias at individual level, very simplified, we can view the process of an emerging bias this way, including the opportunities for prevention on the one side and for detection and mitigation on the other. There are also some moderating factors that may amplify or weaken the bias as it emerges. So the confirmation bias is probably the most famous of them all. Confirmation bias makes us subconsciously look for and favor confirmatory information and overlook and explain away information that contradicts our beliefs. However, there are several other biases that should be on the radar of those handling incidents or doing investigative work. Contextual bias refers to influence of extraneous information on decision-making, often irrelevant to the task, and particularly in forensic and investigative contexts. It occurs when background details, such as a suspect's criminal history or an investigator's expectations, subtly shape how evidence is interpreted. For instance, knowing that a suspect has confessed may unconsciously sway a fingerprint examiner's judgment, especially if the print is ambiguous. Similarly to other cognitive biases, it often operates outside our conscious awareness and can contaminate supposedly objective assessments. The anchoring bias involves individuals relying too heavily on an initial piece of information, the anchor, when making decisions. And once the anchor is set, subsequent judgments are made by adjusting away from it, often insufficiently. And this can lead also to skewed assessments. The availability bias occurs when people judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. For instance, of the risk of a shark attack. Events that are recent, emotionally charged, or widely reported are more readily recalled and therefore seem more common than they actually are. And lastly, and equally important, overconfidence. And this is characterized by individuals overrating their own knowledge or judgment. And these are only a few of the hundreds of biases that have been conceptualized through research in the recent years. The biasing sources that distort forensic or investigative work can be systematized in several ways. This figure is created by the cognitive neuroscientist Dr. E.T.L. Dror and shows how sources of bias from the intrinsic and individual ones in the bottom of the pyramid, related to cognitive and personal factors and education and training, through the sources related to the environment, the culture and experience in the middle, and to the very case-specific sources of bias on the top. And in forensic work, contextual influences on decision-making have been devoted much attention from researchers, and this belongs to the upper part of this pyramid. And we'll take a look at that later. The research has led to targeted mitigation techniques to manage these influences and preserve the forensic analyst's subjectivity and attention towards the evidence itself without being influenced by irrelevant case information. However, a blind spot in this body of research was digital forensics. And in my PhD project, I set up an experiment to test whether contextual influences affected digital forensic work, and more specifically, in what evidence they found, how they interpreted what they found, and how they concluded. And in this experiment, the digital forensic experts were given a scenario where confidential information had been leaked to a competing corporation. The digital forensic examiners were asked to analyze a forensic copy of the laptop belonging to one employee who was a suspect, and to test contextual influences on their decision-making. They were provided, secretly of course, with different task-relevant information alongside their assignment. So one group was told that the suspect had confessed to the crime of leaking confidential information, strongly indicating guilt. A second group was informed about the wage conflict, where the suspect took sides with the underpaid workers, indicating that she had motivation to leak information about unfair salaries. And this context was also indicating guilt, however, more weakly than the first one. A third group was told that the police believed the suspect had been triggered to send information outside the firm, indicating that this was a phishing attack and that she was innocent. And finally, the fourth group was a control group, which was not giving any information alongside this assignment. And this experiment setup enables us to measure whether the contextual influence influenced the investigative work and whether the guilt or innocence indicators had an effect. So then, 53 digital forensic examiners with different contextual information set out to analyze the exact same evidence as mentioned, the forensic copy of the laptop belonging to the suspect. And they all wrote reports about their results as they would normally do. And did we find a bias? Yes. The results show that the context influenced their findings. The group with innocence context found significantly less evidence than the groups with the guilt contexts. So is this surprising? Actually, not very much. This aligned very much with the vast majority of studies in other forensic domains. Numerous studies have shown that even DNA analysts or fingerprint examiners' decision-making is affected when they are exposed to task-irrelevant context. Nevertheless, to the digital forensics domain, these findings were striking and eye-opening because most would view digital evidence as objective and value-neutral, and thus not susceptible to influences such as task-irrelevant information. So drawing on a model developed by Wilson and Brekke to mitigate bias, there are several factors that must be in place. First and foremost, there must be knowledge and awareness of bias, but that is not enough. There must be training in debiasing strategies, and one must be motivated to correct a bias. And moreover, one must be able to apply appropriate and effective strategies, debiasing strategies, at the right time. So my study on contextual bias among digital forensic examiners was published in 2021. But to this date, I have no knowledge of digital forensic laboratories implementing measures, particularly to prevent contextual bias. So I wonder, why is nothing happening? Well, I believe one reason is the proliferation of fallacies that are still vividly alive and kicking in this domain. Such fallacies may be voiced this way: I'm aware of bias, and therefore I consider myself protected from it. This may be a result of overconfidence stemming from having heard about bias, for example in a talk like this one, and believing that this awareness will protect you, believing that you will be able to notice if you're biased yourself. However, bias does not work that way. It mainly operates subconsciously. Or statements such as, I only look for facts, and my work is therefore unbiased, which signifies a belief that one can control bias through mere willpower, which unfortunately is not the case either. Or you will hear, I'm an expert, and although I might have been biased in my early career, bias is no longer a problem to me. This relates to the expert fallacy, believing that expertise protects you from bias. However, while expertise may give you some advantages, the trade-off of developing expertise also makes you more vulnerable to bias. You apply top-down processing of information, you automate procedures, and you pay less attention to details, which all makes you a little bit more vulnerable to a bias. Fallacies may also be expressed like, as an analyst, I do not interpret information, I only compile it. And this is an expression of a belief that one is not performing any interpretations, judgments, or decision-making in their work. And I've heard this many times. Analysts preparing graphs and timelines, not understanding how many ways they are building strong narratives and inserting meaning through what the information they choose to highlight or not, and how they order or visualize the data. You may also hear justifications such as applying bias mitigation techniques partially is better than applying none. And this should be a concern for both investigation and incident handling. First, very few techniques have a bias mitigation effect evidenced through research. For instance, analysis of competing hypotheses has been examined several times, and at best we can say there are mixed findings. A few studies report a positive effect on bias reduction, but the majority of studies do not show such an effect. However, when you believe that the techniques help, you may be overconfident that the technique does the job, and hence a higher risk of bias. And to the last one, which is increasingly frequent, I would say, technology solves my bias problem, or will solve my bias problem, I would say. In any of the talks I give on this topic, there is a question that always comes. But don't you think AI will solve the bias problem? Well, AI might become helpful, but technology also brings about additional problems, because much of the judgment and decision-making is then built into the technology, which very often is non-transparent. And technology is never neutral. It's designed to function in a certain way, and it depends on the data available. You all know this. So may be helpful and probably very convincing, but at the same time may be harmful and even causing bias. So we'll come back to an example of a technology-induced bias later. We will change the perspective now. There we go. And move from focusing on the individual to bias as a social issue. I will start with an example for illustration. Some in this audience may not remember or was probably not even born when cameras had film, but once upon a time they did, and I'm old enough to remember it well. So Kodak was a successful company producing cameras and film, and despite inventing the first camera in 1975, Kodak failed to capitalize on this breakthrough due to fears that it would take over the film business, which they dominated. The company's core business model remained wedded to analog film, even as consumer behavior shifted towards digital technologies in the 1990s and early 2000s. Competitors like Sony and Kodak aggressively pursued digital imaging and gained market share, while Kodak delayed and underestimated both the speed and magnitude of the digital shift. So by the time when they were ready to jump on the so-called digital speed train, the other companies had taken over the market shares, and Kodak was bankrupt in 2012. So why am I bringing this story to the table when talking about the social bias? Well, the collapse of Kodak may very well be explained by the social and strong biases such as groupthink or tunnel vision. Kodak leadership were most likely overly confident on their invulnerability, and they had deeply embedded organizational identity to film. Internal advocates for digital strategies were probably marginalized and overlooked, and Kodak's failure shows how tightly knit leadership teams can strengthen shared beliefs and ignore warning signs, which can lead to dangerous inaction. So social biases have been subject to research also for a long time. I find them particularly relevant for investigation and incident handling, since this is often, as we also have heard on the stage earlier today, a team or group-based activity. We are social creatures, and social mechanisms related to hierarchy, connectedness, and belonging are fundamental and inherent mechanisms for survival and well-being. At the same time, these mechanisms cause us to collectively walk off a cliff sometimes. So in addition to the groupthink illustrated by the Kodak case, an interesting social bias is the Abilene paradox. The Abilene paradox is a social bias where group members collectively agree to a course of action that none of them individually support due to a false belief that others desire it. It arises from a breakdown in communication where individuals fail to express their true preferences out of fear of dissent or conflict, leading to decisions that contradict the group's actual interests. The escalation of the Vietnam War has been linked to this particular phenomenon. Adversarial allegiance is another social bias observed in legal and forensic contexts, where expert witnesses unintentionally align their opinions with the interest of the party that retained them. Although experts are expected to remain objective, research shows that financial, social, or identity-based ties in the hiring side can subtly influence their interpretations and judgments, leading to skewed or partisan testimony. And the fourth social bias I will highlight is authority bias. This bias leads to group members becoming more likely to accept opinions, directives, or judgments of someone perceived as an authority, regardless of the content's actual merit. So this doesn't have to be a boss. This can be a strong group member, for instance. And this unquestioning acceptance can lead to poor decision-making, as critical evaluation is diminished in favor of compliance with perceived expertise or status. So in a group or team, there is typically much communication and interaction going on, and this prepares the ground for bias dynamics, such as snowballing or cascading effects. And I find these mechanisms highly relevant when examining biases related to the social life of investigation and incident handling. Bias snowball refers to the compounding effects of initial cognitive biases in investigations where early judgments, such as presumptions about the suspect, can subtly influence subsequent stages of analysis, causing, for example, a guilt bias to intensify over time. And while a bias may grow in an individual, it can also grow within a group with tunnel vision. Bias cascade describes how bias introduced in one stage of the forensic or investigative process can spread to other stages, thereby contaminating the objectivity of downstream decisions. Both concepts developed by Dr. Itiel Dror and colleagues highlight how systemic interdependence and lack of cognitive safeguards can allow minor biases to escalate into major errors in criminal justice outcomes. In incident handling, we find several measures particularly targeting biases in groups or team settings. I've already mentioned analysis of competing hypotheses, but red team analysis and key assumptions check are examples of measures that are aimed to also counter biases, such as groupthink and tunnel vision. A measure for countering authority bias is to encourage junior input and lower the social boundaries to bring fresh eyes to a new problem. And in the literature on forensic investigation, several measures are also recommended. Typically, these are more about controlling the information flow and avoiding task-irrelevant information to travel across group members. These are, for example, compartmentalization of work, which prevents irrelevant context to travel across the investigation process, or linear sequential unmasking, which is a procedure aimed to ensure that evidence is analyzed and assessed before context is introduced. However, many of the debiasing techniques seem to be designed without taking the social life into consideration. In digital forensic investigations, we see that police organizations try to avoid irrelevant case information affecting forensic decision-making. So there are procedures for how to submit a request and routines for what information should be included into the submission forms to restrict this context to start to flow. And these procedures are typically followed. However,
The communication and interaction flows in organizations are sometimes like a river you try to stop with your bare hands. Similarly to water finding its way, so will communication. So after restricting the information that is noted in the submission form, the investigator calls the forensic investigator to clarify or add information or to ask for some advice. And during such conversations, one would typically discuss what the case is all about, what the investigator expects of the forensic expert to find, and so on. And this is typically not documented. So what seems to be a restricted information flow is in fact quite the opposite sometimes. Okay, so far we have talked about bias as an individual and a social issue. We will change the perspective now and look at bias from a socio-technical perspective. Digital forensics is a tool-dependent discipline, and method validation would therefore include tool verification. But these quality assurance mechanisms rarely include the last part of the socio-technical process, namely the human interpretation of the tool's output. So in a recent study, which was published earlier this year, we explored whether the software frequently used by digital forensic practitioners can distort their decision-making. The study was done together with Police Superintendent Daniel Bing Andersen from Oslo Police District and Associate Professor Kyle Porter from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. It was hypothesized that issues with tools was particularly relevant when investigating activities and events. And this is a list of relevant activity level traces to explore typically on a smartphone. There's a myriad of sensors, as you probably know very well, on the cell phone itself, logging loads of activities, and the operative system also logs user activities in the applications. And altogether, this can be essential information in the criminal investigation, of course. And some of you might have seen the Murdoch series and know it very well. Alex Murdoch was sentenced for the murder of his wife and son, and cell phone evidence was crucial to placing him on the crime scene. A Snapchat sent from his son's phone minutes before the murders revealed Alex's voice in the background, placing him near the victims. And to the right, you see the timeline presented in court by the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. The prosecution assumed that Maggie died around 8:50, which is marked in red. You will probably not be able to read it in the back, but that's not important. The traces on Maggie's phone reveal that after the alleged time of death, the phone traveled 59 steps, and the phone orientation changed, and the screen lit up, etc., indicating that someone was moving her phone after she had deceased. So the phone can reveal not only incriminating content, but also help mapping activities or events relevant to the crime during a certain time period. So back to our experiment, the first author of our paper, who is a digital forensic practitioner, had seen lots of flawed interpretations and erroneous conclusions in police reports about cell phone activity level traces, which led to the following research question for us. Could software be a biasing source in these investigations? And if so, which biasing factors could be identified? So a small experiment was set up with 6 experienced digital forensic practitioners. They were presented to a scenario where a woman had been found dead and a set of questions to answer. So one group was presented to data obtained from Celebrite Physical Analyzer, and the other group, data obtained with the software Apollo. And the exact same questions. So after handling in the responses, all were interviewed about how they performed their analysis and how they interpreted and reasoned around their findings. And when examining the results, we saw that their analysis had led to many erroneous conclusions. And in the first part of our analysis, we categorized flaws in 3 groups: what solely could be attributed to the tool missing the trace, what solely could be attributed to the human factor, and the third category, which was related to the socio-technical interplay between the human and the analysis software, and we'll name this category misleading presentation by the tool, and we'll dive into that in a short while. Let's start with the tool trace miss category. Although it's not about bias, it's also interesting, so I'll include it. Among digital forensic practitioners, it's well known that tools have different capabilities, so this might not have been very surprising to them or to you. However, investigators or the general public tend to think that tool output would be the same regardless of which tool one applies. So here the tools diverge significantly in their performance in terms of extraction and processing of databases. While Cellebrite produced 12 databases and approximately 14,000 rows of data, Apollo provided 16 databases and approximately 55,000 rows of data. So in our analysis, we found that 12 errors were due to the tool missing the traces, thereof 9 associated with Cellebrite, and only 3 with Apollo. There were also some errors that could not be explained by anything else than a human error. The trace was there, clearly presented, but they did not take the time to look for it, it seemed. This was also confirmed in the post-experiment interviews. For example, in one task, one participant from each group overlooked SMS messages that were clearly and unambiguously presented by the tools. So these were considered cases of negligence. And here, more of the errors were actually related to the Apollo group compared to the Cellebrite group, where 6 of the flaws were related to Cellebrite and 10 to Apollo. However, what was most interesting and novel in this research was the category that could not be explained by either the human factor or the tool missing the trace. And this was also the largest category of flaws. So when examining this category, we identified 4 factors associated with errors due to the misleading presentation by the tool. And these factors seem to have led to or contributed to the errors. So the first factor was misleading naming conventions, which involved ambiguous labeling of data such as column names, attribute descriptors, names of individual activities such as connect, disconnect, and so on, or naming of activity categories such as communications data, here you have health data, and so on. The second factor was lack of details and context. And this factor involved the absence of relevant data necessary to interpret the meaning of the data correctly. So not only can exposure to task-irrelevant information cause a bias and flawed decision-making, so can also lack of task-relevant information. A third factor was data loss by aggregation, and this entails the software presenting aggregated data where the necessary detail to allow accurate interpretation and precise results was lacking. So this led, for example, to the last signs of life for the victim in the scenario being skewed by half an hour, which would be a catastrophe in a real investigation. And the fourth factor was misleading presentation of timestamps. Timestamps are always important in a criminal investigation. And this involved inadequate ordering of data and insufficient connection between the interlinked timestamps, leading to flawed interpretations of the timelines of the case. So these are all novel factors which needs to be explored further through research. But there's no doubt that digital forensic work is highly technology dependent, which makes this discovery even more important. We have only tested 2 different tools. We could have employed many other, of course, and we hope to do that in the future. And we have only tested with a very small group of experiment participants. So at the moment, this cannot only be anything more than a hypothesis or a strengthened hypothesis about a tool-induced bias. The scholar Paul Reedy has warned about dumbing down tools and that this may lead to errors. And our research informs on the factors that are in play when user-friendliness may have been taken too far. The findings are also important when thinking about tool verification and validation, which already takes up much of the time of digital forensic units and lab. Including user groups to check the interpretation is an important part of the tool verification procedures if we rely on this research. Also, the findings underscore the necessity of peer verification review with a different tool to be able to uncover either the tool-induced bias or the tool trace miss. So, the final perspective I will include is the systems perspective. I'm currently involved in research exploring practices in digital forensic units across Europe, as Mona mentioned, but as the analysis is still ongoing, I will focus on research on digital forensic practice in Norwegian digital forensic units to illustrate the systems perspective. In 2023, we did a deep dive into how digital forensic work was organized and carried out in Norway, and 3 notable findings were that the execution of the digital forensic process has changed. The investigators without digital forensic expertise are doing more of the analysis work on the seized devices, while the digital forensic experts are mainly performing the collection and facilitation of analysis. They are rarely performing the advanced technical analysis task now. So to understand the change, it might be useful to consider the past developments. If we consider the digital forensic process, let's say 15 to 20 years ago, there was typically one digital forensic practitioner conducting the full process from identification to presentation, typically writing 1 or 2 reports, an acquisition report and then the full analysis report. Today, it's quite different. The process is more fragmented, more people are involved in the process, and digital forensic expertise does not play the same role as it used to. So today, identification of data carriers is mainly done by other personnel than the digital forensic expert, typically patrol officers or investigators in a criminal investigation setting. The collection is also distributed. Digital forensic practitioners are primarily doing the collection of computers still, while digital forensic liaisons, which are police with some digital forensic training, are doing more of the cell phone acquisitions, which overflood the investigations currently. Similarly, processing and preparation for the analysis is also distributed and conducted either by digital forensic experts or those liaisons. And the analysis stage has become a multi-phased stage. The investigative review, as you see in the top, involves reviewing the seized data for findings with relevance to the case, and this is mainly done by personnel without digital forensic expertise, such as investigators. Verification of the results from investigative review and deeper technical analysis are still done by digital forensic experts. And the ideal path through this process includes the investigative review, verification, and then the deeper technical analysis to have all the traces and have them verified. All good. However, the problem is verification and technical analysis is typically executed only on demand from investigators when they find it necessary. So the ideal path of the process currently seems to be reserved to severe crimes such as homicide and grave organized crime. And to illustrate the diminishing role of the digital forensic expert, the current highway through the process goes like this: not utilizing digital forensic expertise in verification of the results or a deeper technical analysis. And to the most extreme, the digital forensic expert is excluded from the entire process. A patrol officer collects, a liaison performs the acquisition, and the investigator does the analysis and writes up the results, which is directly filed into the case. And it's the investigator that is called to court to testify about the findings, his, her, or her interpretations of the findings and any conclusions. And the consequences, a higher risk of misinterpretation or erroneous results introduced into the investigation or in court. So you here in the audience today represent various legal systems, and some of you might say, but that's not possible. They cannot present an opinion in court because they do not qualify as expert witnesses. Well, in Norway, and probably more of the Nordic countries such as Denmark and Sweden, there is no such threshold. As long as the evidence is relevant, it will typically be allowed into court, and it's up to the judge to decide what weight they want to put on the evidence. And digital forensic practitioners told me that there is very little resistance in the courtroom. The defense lawyer does not know how to challenge the evidence, nor does the judge. They simply believe that digital evidence is objective and reliable. Okay, so you might be thinking, is this a real problem? Does this highway through the digital forensic process lead to any critical errors? Well, here are some examples from real casework. The Supreme Court in Norway recently overturned a conviction in a serious drug case after it was revealed that the investigator had confused copies of the digital evidence from mobile phones, erroneously linking the wrong seizure to the defendant. In another case, thumbnails were misinterpreted as downloaded child abuse material, though they had been merely cached through browsing. A third example, here the claim concerned that the accused had filmed himself with a mobile phone while driving in high speed before a traffic collision with a pedestrian. It was disproven. The file was in fact not filmed by the defendant, but received as a video file in a messaging app. And the final example, an assertion that Snapchat had been used moments before a collision in a pedestrian crossing was incorrect. The message had been sent earlier, but due to lack of network coverage, it was only delivered just before the incident. So is this unique to Norway? Probably not. In a recent report from the Westminster Commission on Forensic Science, they state the following about the handling of digital evidence in England and Wales, and I will read the full quote. Many personnel involved in digital evidence handling lack specialized training with unqualified individuals managing investigations, which can compromise the depth and accuracy of forensic analysis. Untrained officers are processing digital evidence because of unmet demand, but with insufficient depth and knowledge to identify exculpatory evidence reliably. We were told of investigators working beyond their skill set, officers dabbling with digital devices with insufficient training in correct seizure and preservation of exhibits, this being the most critical point of evidence gathering and processing. So why did we arrive, or how did we arrive here? Well, there is not a single factor to point out, but I will rather suggest the interplay between different circumstances having caused this situation. So from a systemic or systems perspective, sources of bias and error may be caused by institutional pressure, resource limitations, ambiguity around roles and responsibilities, weak peer review or verification procedures, as we have seen examples from now, embedded cognitive traps such as tunnel vision, groupthink, and so on, absence of independent oversight, and finally, normalization of deviance. And we will take a closer look at this phenomenon before we close up. Normalization of deviance occurs in systems that evolve under the assumption that most components and actors perform their roles correctly. Deviations from professional principles or standards become gradually normalized because they do not immediately result in a catastrophe. Over time, control mechanisms erode and the system becomes more vulnerable. And knowledge that one's work will not be reviewed may gradually undermine incentives and motivation to ensure quality. Applied to digital investigation, this means that if police, prosecutors, or courts uncritically accept digital traces as reliable truth, the pressure for accountability is weakened and quality may deteriorate over time. So the normalization of deviance has been linked to catastrophes such as the Challenger accident illustrated to the right in this picture. In the case of Challenger, engineers had observed problems with O-rings in previous launches, but continued to approve flights as no immediate failure occurred. This routine acceptance of anomalies ultimately contributed to the disaster when the same issue led to catastrophic failure. Okay, we're approaching the end of my presentation. I started off with this picture, the search for a root cause. From what I've shown today, I hope you all see that relying on individuals to tackle the issue of bias and risk is most likely inadequate in terms of bias mitigation. My message today is that relying on a single method or even a single perspective to tackle bias and error is insufficient. Instead, the bias issue needs a holistic approach involving strategic planning, thoughtful and effective measures, targeting bias from individual, group, socio-technical, and systemic perspectives. So again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to give this opening keynote and thankful for you all spending the Monday morning of this conference reflecting on the issue of bias together with me. We have time for some questions or comments, which I very much welcome. So thank you all for your attention. Anyone?
Good morning.
Good morning.
This talk was excellent. I really appreciate you doing this. I don't think bias is getting enough attention in our industry, so this is awesome. Here's my question. Your talk focuses on processes, procedures, and situations focused on what I will characterize as traditional digital forensics. And I'm curious, for those of us who have a focus on incident investigation, and when I use the word investigation, I don't mean in the legal sense. I mean people chasing bad guys on networks and in the cloud and such, where we're not looking at, say, hard drives or cell phones. We're looking predominantly at logs. I can see many of your bias situations showing up there as well. So I'm curious, in your research, or the research that is adjacent to your work, did you find techniques that are applicable when you're in a highly time-constrained type situation where you are racing against an adversary who is on the wire and you're trying to get them out? So that my question is what techniques have you found are very effective when we have to eliminate bias in the time period of minutes or hours? Thank you.
Thank you for a very good question. And I would have to say that in terms of effective evidenced by research, we don't have very many techniques that we can say eliminates bias. However, drawing on experiences and also research from criminal investigation, which is also very often challenged by time issues. It's not very different in the first golden hours of a criminal investigation, I think, from what you describe. It's very important to ensure that you don't only have a single hypothesis or a single suspect that you focus on, but that you constantly remind yourself, and even in writing, to have alternative explanations or alternative hypotheses about what may have happened, so you don't strengthen a tunnel vision towards one plausible explanation, because you will very often find many things that will support your hypotheses in these logs or in the knowledge among those working with the case, but having written down alternative hypotheses and committing yourself to actually evaluating the traces that you're finding in relation to the other hypotheses. You might sometimes see that they don't point in only one direction, they might point in several directions.
Thank you.
So in the big picture types of biases that you framed, that's what I want to focus on, socio-technical and so on. Did you find that some were more responsive to others? So to clarify, I would hope that when biases are pointed out to people, they work to challenge them and fix them within themselves. But maybe the tooling is harder to get changed than the people. So did you find any things easier or harder to change when combating these biases that we could learn from?
Again, a very good question. So if some of these perspectives are easier to, so bias at one of these perspectives are easier to mitigate compared to the others, is that your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the main message from my talk is actually not focus on just one, because that makes you even more vulnerable, I think. If you think you have mitigated bias at individual level, you could possibly miss out on the group processes that are going on or in between the techniques you apply. So from my side, I would emphasize having a more holistic approach to bias mitigation, planning for this bias mitigation in advance and not in the situation when it occurs. Management, it needs to be managed and also implemented as part of the other methodologies that we are using to solve cases, and bias mitigation must be integrated into those frameworks and managed or led in the work. But as you say, cannot easily be eliminated in the tools, but having the knowledge that the tools actually introduce a bias and can do that, that would also make us include other aspects when we are validating our tools, and maybe also include what do we actually interpret the output in the same way. So having those perspectives within our planning, in the planning stage, I think is really important.
If I can clarify a little, given you want us to focus on it holistically, and I agree with that, the hardest problem will be the one that defines where we end up. So if there's one that's harder and we could look at that and fix it, I'm just interested in comparatively how you approach mitigating these biases, of course holistically, but.
Could you please reformulate?
What's the hardest problem in the mitigation space that would take the longest for us to change as a society?
The hardest part, and this is me speculating and not referring to research, because we don't have this research saying which problems are the most hard to tackle. I would, from my experience, having worked with this issue in more than 10 years now, I would say convincing people that they are not the exception is the hardest part. When you also look into surveys on whether one sees bias as a problem, that's the core problem, I think, in organizations. One tends to think that this is a problem to all the others and not yourself. And we tend to live with those fallacies that I've heard about bias, so now I'm aware and I think I can tackle it through my willpower and through my awareness. So having overcome that core belief that this is something that is vivid and ongoing in our investigations, I think is the main issue that we need to implement. And that means building this into training, building this into how when we do our tests and train on scenarios and so on, to ensure that we are building in those measures also there, and maintaining awareness and willingness to actually try to tackle this issue.
Thank you.
I'm glad you mentioned training in scenarios. I've tried to incorporate bias into my training exercises, but not nearly as comprehensive as what you talked about here today. So I love this presentation. Are you aware of existing training materials that can be used in exercises to test these different biases? Because I've found even in the small part that I've done, it's very eye-opening for people when they get to and of course in an exercise, you know what the conclusion is, so you can get to the point of demonstrating to them that their bias had an influence. Are you aware of existing training materials that can help with that?
The only awareness I have of training material is from own work. It's mainly in a criminal investigative context, but I would assume there would be training material around. I have no knowledge, but I think we're here for sharing. So people will now know that you would want it. So please contact either me or.
Okay, I'll follow up with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Nina. I thought you highlighting the expertise paradox was very interesting, and this defragmentation of the investigation process and the fact that sort of the investigators are the ones that often are testifying in court and perhaps do not have the expertise. Do you see, you highlight that this is an issue in Norway, it's also been highlighted as an issue in England, Wales, but do you see any other nations and legal systems doing something to actually address this problem on a more systematic level? And if so, what are they doing to do that?
Well, my experience is only from the European countries so far, and doing research, ongoing research in these countries. So there are measures trying to compartmentalize the process, so to avoid bias traveling throughout the process. For instance, in Scotland, I know that they have introduced checkpoints to not have all of this contact between the investigator and the one executing the digital forensic analysis. However, we see that, as I said, this informal communication is still flowing. We have phones and we have email, and the proximity of, we work in the same building, so we talk of the coffee machine and so on. So although there are measures introduced, we see that they are not bulletproof. And that's why we need this awareness to understand why we have included or incorporated these measures, so we can also understand why it is important not to inform, for instance, the digital forensic examiner about what you think about the suspect or what they might find if they look closely and so on. But yeah, I think standardization is one of the measures that are being implemented. But again, we need more research also to measure how effective those measures are.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your talk, but also the anecdotes about timestamp confusion in evidentiary chains. The story that you tell, the entire causal chain hinges on timestamps, which we often sort of maybe see as being carved by the hand of God herself. And I like that you highlighted the ambiguity around that given a sufficiently complex set of data or evidence, there's probably more than one story that you could tell with that. Is there, within the field of criminology or police science, some literature on like challenging and grounding timelines that might be useful in our community of incident responders? Like, is there something I can go read on this?
Yes, so there is a very little branch within criminology that focuses on this area. Myself being one of them, of course, but there are a few others also looking into the practices of digital forensics or incident handling from a more social science perspective or criminology perspective. So there's some research in the UK on practices, as far as I know, some in the Netherlands, as far as I know. And also some from the Norwegian digital forensic practices that I've been involved in myself. But it's not much, because much of the research on these disciplines have been very technically focused and not so much on the practices and the interplay between human and technology and in the interplay with human and system and organizations. so far, and it's been focused more on, let's say, other types of technical evidence, such as DNA evidence and so on from the criminology side, not so much on digital evidence, which is the newcomer. They still call it a newcomer in that branch, which I think is a little bit late to say now, but yeah, it's getting, even digital forensics is getting old.
Hello. Extremely interesting topic. It's one of my favorite ones at the moment, so thank you so much. In my simple research of this, I think sometimes in my brain we end up in kind of like a bias death spiral, because every time we try to counter bias, we introduce some other wing of bias attack. You said it yourself, just knowing about bias from a talk like this makes you overconfident. So what is our takeaway? Where do we start? Is there a cheat code? How do we get started?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last part, which was your question, actually.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so where do we actually start in this? What can we bring home and get started where we are on a good path in starting to countering all these biases?
Well, what I would recommend you to do is actually start measuring in mock casework. Start doing mock casework, manufactured cases, and do training altogether, and then compare your results and see whether some of whether your work was biased in that training situation. The problem with bias is that we cannot see it as it is ongoing, and we cannot find it when it has happened. It's a constructed explanation. So if we want to observe it and study when it happens, we need to do that in experimental situations. And you don't need a researcher to experiment and test on this. So I would encourage those teams and groups to actually introduce this into their training and measure whether for instance, contextual influences would influence some of your participants in the group and some not, and so on. So you can experience yourself what happens in a process that is similar to what you would do in your daily work life, so to speak. So I would encourage to introduce this into the training where on your actual work. Close to your actual work, and focus on experiencing this so you can see for yourself, because then it's possible actually to overcome, I think, this overconfidence that this is not happening to me. From the 53 examiners I included in my research, I think 99% of them thought they would not be biased before they entered the exercise. And I think afterwards, many of them were surprised that this was possible. So I think that living that experience is really important.
Thank you, Nina.
Okay.
Your focus, of course, was criminal investigation because that's your background. But similar effects and biases could also happen in crisis management, finding a technical reason for a defect. Do you have any advice for us what to look out for when doing crisis management, not to fall into groupthink and similar issues?
If I have a little bit of problem hearing, was it crime analysis you
So if you're doing crisis response, crisis management, so not investigation, but crisis response, are there learnings from your research that's useful for crisis response as well?
Oh, that's a good question. Crisis response, and whether this is also I'm not sure how I would like, because then the crisis is not, you don't need alternative hypotheses for well, you are probably trying to predict then what will be the outcome of this crisis. And again, I think, and then making many decisions in terms of how to plan your resources and your actions in terms of what may happen in the future. Isn't that correct?
Or what might have been the reason for the crisis?
Yeah, okay.
There may be multiple hypotheses on why this thing is happening.
Yeah, I think it's quite similar actually to any. I think this is quite universal. What I talked about today is in terms of investigative work, either working forward or backwards in a way, prediction or retrodiction, if we should use that in complex word, in terms of trying to reconstruct what has happened on the one hand side and also trying to predict what may happen as a result of the situation we have now. Again, I think we're down to like the awareness and training and also working with different scenarios or hypotheses or explanations backwards, but also forward in terms of what could have and what may be happening to ensure that you're not having this tunnel vision evolving also into such an investigation. That's my guess, but I have not done any research or not familiar with any research in that particular area, but thank you for a very good question.
I'm going to go up to the microphone. I think that was perfect, just on time with the questions and the answer. And I think there's a lot to be learned from this research in all the areas that we work in. So I would really like to thank you for coming and presenting, and you will be here all week, right?
Only until Wednesday.
Until Wednesday. So if you have any further questions or want to discuss anything more, please reach out. And with that, we will go into our first break. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.